Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif says that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, including the state terrorism, should be condemned in a clear and unambiguous terms. He was addressing the 23rd Heads of States Summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was virtually hosted by India. The Foreign Office had earlier said, let me quote, Prime Minister Shehbaz's participation illustrates the high importance that Pakistan attaches to the SCO as an important forum for regional security and prosperity and enhanced engagement with the region, unquote. Now, the Prime Minister in his address urged the SCO member states to take concerted and immediate actions to combat terrorism, extremism and separatism. He's also mentioned Pakistan's unparalleled sacrifices in fighting the scourge of terrorism. The Prime Minister also highlighted the humanitarian and the economic crisis Afghanistan is faced with and urged the international community to engage with Afghanistan to avert that. He at the same time also urged the interim Afghan authorities to take concrete measures to combat terrorism and ensure that its soil is not used by any entity for the purpose of terrorism. The Prime Minister also urged the SCO members to oppose divisive policies based on prejudice and discrimination. The Prime Minister also mentioned UN principles for the resolution of the long-standing disputes. He also highlighted the significance of CPAC. The Prime Minister said it could be a game changer for regional connectivity and prosperity of the region. This significant address by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif at the 23rd Heads of State SCO Summit will be taking different points of this important address with our panelists. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem, his former Foreign Secretary. Mr. Jauhar, thank you very much for your time, for being with us at Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. At the same time, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Brigadier retired Mohammed Zeeshan. He is Director General, Center for Peace, Security and Developmental Studies. Brigadier Zeeshan, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Jauhar, highlighting this scourge of terrorism at this very important mood. The Prime Minister has done it rightly in his comprehensive address to this mood today. Was it required at this moment? Was it the need of the hour, especially given the circumstances? There had been an upsurge of terrorism recently here in Pakistan as well, and Pakistan being the victim of terrorism itself. Especially when we talk about the cross-border terrorism and the state-sponsored terrorism from India.
Thank you. I think it was very important, of course, and critical in some ways, not just because of the fact that the scourge of terrorism persists, and not only it is hampering Pakistan's internal security and progress, but also the regional peace and security. But we also have to remember that before the Prime Minister's address, Prime Minister Modi, in his welcoming remarks, he had repeated the usual hackneyed refrain of India about cross-border terrorism emanating, although he didn't name Pakistan, but of course it was very clear that he was pointing fingers at Pakistan, and the usual language of words to the effect of harboring terrorists and using it as an instrument of policy. So because of that as well, it was very important that the Prime Minister of Pakistan addressed that, and he addressed it befittingly, in a very detailed manner, and in a very unbiased manner as well. Basically what he said, which you have mentioned in your highlights of the address as well, is that this should not be used. Terrorism is a common problem of all the countries of the world, global terrorism in particular, and in our region even more so. And the way forward is cooperation. The way forward is not a blame game, and it should not be, terrorism should not be used by some countries just as a cudgel for diplomatic point scoring. And that is very apt because India has been doing it for a long time. They actually leave no opportunity, as we saw even Modi's recent visit to the US. There, we heard this hackneyed refrain, and not just in his sort of verbal comments or interviews, but also in the joint statement which emanated from there. So because of that, I think it was, and it's not just Pakistan, other countries also, in their statements, the leaders of China, Russia, and other countries, they also mentioned that terrorism continued to pose a serious challenge to regional security, and it is incumbent upon the countries and the members of the SCO to together address this common challenge.
So, Mr. Jauhar, your point is well taken. What about the responsibility of the SCO member states in particular to call spade a spade, to actually identify where this particular terrorism, this scourge is actually emanating from, where it is being sponsored from? So what happens to be the responsibility of the member states to call that particular country out, that it had been sponsoring terrorism and trying to divert the attention of the international community and pointing fingers towards others?
Well, SCO members, of course, like as usual in international diplomacy, they state their positions. Every country has their position on particular issues, and that's what they do in these international forums. Having said that, I think the Prime Minister also did well in pointing out that terrorism just is not about individuals or organizations. It could be state terrorism as well, and unleashed against people, particularly people facing occupation, as we see in the case of the people of illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And also he mentioned about the demonization of religious minorities, which we see so much in India, and Islamophobia that we see in India again, and some other countries, like even in Europe sometimes. So he talked about that. He talked about the freedoms. And you see, all these things are very important for creating a conducive environment for cooperation between countries, and creating an environment for connectivity, and creating an ambience for development, because development cannot take place in a vacuum. So, and also, I think he very clearly mentioned Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is important. But in Afghanistan, there were 2 points that the Prime Minister made. The first was that the international community has to engage with Afghanistan. And that is of key importance, because this is something which has not been happening lately, but it's very important, not just for the internal security, and not just security in terms of security, but also food security, for instance, economic security of Afghanistan. And also in terms of, because if there's no engagement, then Afghanistan cannot really contribute to regional connectivity. On the other hand, he also called upon the Afghan Taliban to ensure their part of the bargain, their promises, that which primarily is that the Afghan soil would not be allowed to be used for terrorism by any group or any individuals. And that is of key importance for Pakistan in particular, because we are facing a lot of terrorism emanating from across the border.
Right.
But for other countries as well. And I think this is a concern which some other countries mentioned as well. Interestingly enough, the Indian Prime Minister, 2 points that he mentioned were actually pretty close to what Pakistan's position is. One is he stressed the need for humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. And the other is, of course, ensuring that the Afghan soil is not used for promoting terrorism in neighboring countries.
Right. Right, Mr. Jauhar, you've highlighted very significant points of the Prime Minister's address today at the SCO Summit. Let me bring in Brigadier Zeeshan into the discussion. Also, Brigadier Zeeshan, isn't it ironic when we talk about the scourge of terrorism? Of course, Pakistan had been a victim of this scourge for a long time, had to pay a huge price in terms of men and material over the number of years. When we talk about Indian attitude in dealing with this particular one, this issue, it keeps on pointing fingers towards Pakistan, and especially isn't it ironic by looking at this very statement by Prime Minister Modi urging the international community and the SCO member states in particular not to hesitate to condemn countries that support terror. What's your understanding of it?
Oh, very interesting statement, and Prime Minister Modi, emboldened by his successful visit of United States and what he achieved there in terms of the terrorism factor, naming Pakistan over there as harboring terrorism, and especially in case of India. So now here, as has been highlighted by the worthy Secretary Jauhar, Prime Minister Modi was lot more careful. Reason being, this SCO is a regional forum and everybody knows what has been happening here. And most of the countries are neighboring Afghanistan or are within the vicinity, within the region, if not directly bordering Afghanistan. So they are all, they have experience and are all affected by what has happened in Afghanistan since last 23 years. Now, India has had this diplomatic line to blame Pakistan since 9/11, and they have been successful. At times, they have not been very successful, and we have seen senior members of American government naming India particularly for harboring or supporting terrorism affecting Pakistan. So at the moment you may say that point scoring has been done, but people within the SCO know exactly that who has been doing what, and India has to be careful when they talk at the regional level. Reason that Indians may not get the kind of appreciation or their follies are ignored as they get this breather in Washington.
Right, Brigadier Zeeshan, I seek your pardon for the interjection over here. You just mentioned that SU member states are aware of the real picture. So that made India a little conscious this time around, not mentioning the name of Pakistan, right? So you already mentioned that India or Prime Minister Modi is emboldened by his recent US visit. Now, if the SCO member states are aware of the real ground situation, why the authorities in the US, especially President Biden, is not aware of the great sacrifices Pakistan made, which are, of course, unparalleled in fighting this scourge?
Well, that's a very entirely different issue what happened in Washington. It was a bigger game than SCO for both India and United States. They had to show, United States and Biden administration had to show to the world that India is still within the US camp. And there were certain doubts on this status after Ukraine, occupation of Ukraine, or you may say the offensive of Russian offensive in Ukraine, and what India has been doing with Russia. So within that scenario, Biden administration had to give a feeling to its allies and world community in general that India is with them. And more importantly, it's election year 2024 in, I think, both countries. So most of the things which happened in Washington, they had their significance certainly, but the diplomatic motives were particularly different.
Right, Mr. Jawad, this particular same question to you also. If the SCO member states are aware of the real ground situation, why not the authorities in the US? Do you agree with what Brigadier Zeeshan has to say?
Yeah, well, there are multiple reasons for that, of course. Countries are very aware of what happens in the international arena and what different countries are doing in different contexts. What happened in the US, I think, was based very much on the strategic interests of the US. And those strategic interests, as we know, they are not just about their thinking of India as a possible counterweight against China. That is important, of course, and we all know that. And it's not just important for America, it's important for the West in general. But besides that, India is a rising economic power. And it's actually now the biggest economy in the world, biggest in terms of the highest GDP growth. Out of the big economies, it has the highest GDP growth. So that economic weight, a country whose exports are set to cross $900 billion this year, reserves have crossed $750 billion, and so on, and sort of, and there's a very close collaboration between big US tech companies and India. There are many Indian cities where most of their work is outsourced. And that is an increasing trend. So all these factors, see, I always say that what happens in diplomacy does not really reflect any affinity to principles or values, perhaps sometimes to a certain degree, but most often and for most part, it reflects shared interests of countries. And that is what we saw in the US. And probably we'll see more of that in the coming years, because as their interests lie even more. So now, as far as other SCO countries are concerned, they made pretty balanced statements. You see the statement of Xi Jinping and Mr. Putin and other leaders at the conference. They did mention terrorism. They do understand what is going on in the region. They do understand what is happening in India. I mean, nobody is ignorant of that. But of course, countries' positions reflects their relations with different countries as well. So whatever they say about different countries is never without a context. So it's always in the context of the bilateral relations they are having. So I would say, to sum it up, what happened in the US cannot be equated in any way, or what happened in the SCO cannot be seen in the context of what happened in the US.
Right, Mr. Joe, your point is well taken. What I am trying to understand over here is, as Prime Minister has also once again highlighted the unparalleled sacrifices which Pakistan has rendered in fighting this particular scourge, being the front-line ally of the United States of America for over 2 decades. We understand there are economic interests of the US associated with India. So why pinpoint fingers towards a long-time ally who had sacrificed so immensely over the years?
Well, I think there are 2 perspectives here. One is, this is our perspective, right? And we believe that it is an objective perspective. But this would probably not entirely be the US perspective on this issue. Their perspective might be more qualified or more nuanced, because you do have statements emanating from the US where they talk about Pakistan's contributions in the fight against terrorism, but also sometimes there's blame game as well, as we all know, and that has been happening for many, many years, particularly in the context of Afghanistan. So that is there as well.
No,
so
when we talk about in context of Afghanistan, I seek your pardon for the interjection over here. Yeah. Pakistan also facilitated the Afghan peace and reconciliation process.
Yeah.
Right? Pakistan was at the front seat in making that happen, and the Doha peace deal happening between the United States of America and the Afghan Taliban. Also, Pakistan facilitated that one.
Yeah.
So it's not only the sacrifice in the fight against terrorism, but also facilitation of the peace and reconciliation process also.
Yeah, that is actually what we did in the recent years, and particularly towards the end of the, close to the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. I think that is more appreciated in the US generally relative to what happened in the years before, right? But having said that, Afghanistan is not as important for them anymore. What is the most important game right now in the world? We all know that, that is the US-China. So that is the equation. So whatever relates to that gets higher priority, and their relations with India, they fit better in their strategic, in terms of their strategic objectives within that ambit. So I think that, it's, in some ways it seems rather simplistic, but sometimes things are in some ways, simplistic. So because of that, all the sacrifices that we made, all the economic losses that we took, it's not that we didn't really project them well. I think we did a pretty good job of projecting them, and the world knows about them. But if there's still such countries, if they still choose to ignore that, right? So that is something willful then, and there have to be reasons for that, and the reasons are strategic and the reasons are economic.
So Brigadier Zeeshan, how important it is to keep highlighting the great and unparalleled sacrifices Pakistan made in fighting the scourge of terrorism on international fora more often and more repeatedly?
Before I answer this point, Jawad, you have raised, I want to add one thing on the discussion which has just taken place. We must try to understand where the United States Biden administration is today. US, no doubt, is the dominant superpower in the world today, and their policies are pretty effective. They have challenges, but they are addressing them well. However, in Washington, Biden is the face of the government, the Biden administration. That face is particularly not very strong, and it is not radiating the strength which has been done previously by likes of Bush Jr. and Obama, and to some extent Trump also. So this is something which is important in American politics, and calling and giving Prime Minister Modi and French President and any other head of the state who happens to be a major ally of United States, it has become really important. And whatever they said, it has nothing to do with what Pakistan is today or what US-Pakistan relations are. They may not deny the sacrifices made by Pakistan against in the war against terror. However, as has been highlighted by Secretary Jauhar, that importance of India is not more than Pakistan, rather India is in a different league, and Pakistan should not expect some kind of balance in treatment from United States when it comes to India. Pakistan will certainly will not enjoy that kind of attention. So that also answers your question, that we must highlight what we have done, but we have to move forward from what we have already done, and we cannot just keep expecting that people will appreciate us. If we are economically useful, then we will have a political role, and only then we will be accorded any importance or value.
Right. Mr. Jauhar, you already mentioned that Afghanistan doesn't happen to be important this time around for the United States of America. But is it important for the SCO members, the countries in the region, when it comes to dealing with this menace of terrorism?
No, what I said was that Afghanistan is not as important as it used to be.
As it used to be.
Yeah, because that's a very important distinction. It's still important, of course, but not as important, of course, compared to before, when they were spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars there. For SCO countries, on the other hand, Afghanistan is in the region. I mean, they are directly affected by what happens in Afghanistan, not just in terms of terrorism emanating from there, but also in terms of, for some countries, it's about drug trafficking. For some countries, it's about their ethnic minorities as well. So there are various factors, and probably for all these countries, the SCO members, 8 members that we have, and the 9th one, Iran, would, upcoming member. For all of them, Afghanistan is definitely more important.
So how important it is to help Afghanistan avert the dire humanitarian and the economic crisis?
Definitely, I think that would be key. That would be key, because if there's instability in Afghanistan, eventually it will affect everyone. You see, this is what we used to tell the Americans way back, and something which even American leadership mentioned subsequently as their mistake. Hillary Clinton is on record having said that we made a huge mistake, not listening to Pakistan after the Russians left Afghanistan, and and we also left overnight, and we didn't help Afghanistan stabilize. Once again, if Afghanistan is not helped in that way, first of all in terms of humanitarian assistance, second of all in terms of some economic stability, because the country needs some economy, because otherwise you can't just live like countries can't live like beggars. They have to have an economy which could cater for their people's basic needs, and in terms of internal security as well. Okay, so I think that is very important for not just countries of the region, but even countries far off. It would be important for the US as well. Would the US want a situation in Afghanistan in future years where again there is a chaos and terrorist groups find a safe haven? No, they wouldn't. I mean, like the type of situation we saw like 20 years ago, prior to 9/11. They wouldn't. Similarly, for other countries, it's important as well. But unfortunately, I think this insistence that, okay, first Afghanistan, sort of, the preconditions that, okay, you do this, 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 and then we feel engaged. And Pakistan has been saying very clearly on that, okay, we also have our conditions, conditions in the sense that promises that they've made, and we want them to keep those promises, to live up to their words. But at the same time, we believe that continuous engagement is very important for Afghanistan.
So how do you think that engagement could be possible when there has been a consistent violation of those preset conditions of the promises the Afghan authorities made with the international community?
Well, that's a dilemma, right? But again, if there's no humanitarian assistance, if there's no engagement, the situation there could deteriorate. And there could be more space for the sort of, for instability and terrorist groups, right? And that is why, despite the problems and challenges that we are having, we have kept our engagement with, with the Afghan. And that is very important, because if you don't stay engaged, then sometimes those groups within a country, the extremist groups, you see, they strengthen because the argument strengthens.
So, Mr. Jawad, isn't it the question of a realization more of in the ranks of the Afghan Taliban than as compared to the realization among the other countries, especially the regional countries, of bringing ease to the Afghan people? And they have to realize that they have to fulfill the promises. Because of their violations, the international community is unable to engage with them properly, and hence the Afghan people have to suffer as a result.
Well, first of all, I mean, there's no excuse for not taking care of their part of the deal. So, I agree there. They have to take care of their part of the deal, the promises that they've made. At the same time, if you look at the situation a bit deeper, that Afghan Taliban are not really a very homogeneous group. There's sort of, shades of opinion within that group, and, and there are internal sort of, like politics going on, suffice to say that, So it's not, I mean, it's not exactly a sort of, like a government of a developed country, like a very stable government of a developed country where certain policies are decided upon and then just implemented, It's a very different situation. But that should not be an excuse. I think that the Afghan Taliban leadership has to take stock of the situation, and they have to take responsibility for what happens in their own country, and they have to ensure that Afghan soil is not used by any terrorist groups for fomenting terrorism across borders.
Right, Brigadier Zeeshan, Afghanistan is not as important for the US as it used to be, as Mr. Saleem has mentioned. Is it important for the SCO member states? And if yes, what sort of a strategy the SCO member states should adopt in order to engage with the Afghan Taliban, so that the end result is that the common Afghan people are not suffering?
Excellent question, Jawad. I was waiting that you come to this point. We have to zoom out a little bit from Afghanistan, look at SCO. Now 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, we would want, and the SCO members, especially China, Pakistan and Central Asian states, and also India, we would all want economic prosperity in the region. Now that economic prosperity is kind of translated in the scope of SCO, which is about the security of the region, not security in terms of military. Security is economic security, human security, food security. All these aspects come into that. What Central Asian states have to offer, they have energy, gas and oil. What is BRI is connectivity for economic growth and creating industrial zones. And CPAC, the flagship of BRI, is about creating the special economic zones in Pakistan, where the industry from all around the world will come, and certainly Chinese industry will also relocate. And what would they need? What would a growing economy of industrialized India needs? Cheaper energy, and that cheaper energy is provided by Central Asia, who is in between Afghanistan. An unstable Afghanistan is certainly in the interest of United States till they reach a settlement with China in the US-China global competition or conflict, whatever you say. But Afghanistan is the key for the energy link to CPEC-oriented industrial region in Pakistan and the already developed industrial powerhouse of India. So Afghanistan has to be seen in that context. And I am very confident that any government in Kabul understands the importance of Afghanistan in this term. But given the insecurity, the turmoil which Afghanistan has experienced in past 50 years, that has to be kept in mind. Those problems will not go away so quickly. They will take their time. US may not be very eager to settle issues, especially on humanitarian grounds in Afghanistan in short term. However, everybody understands the long-term strategic importance of Afghanistan, the link it provides for the energy of Central Asia into India and Pakistan. And Central Asian states combined are 77 million people, 1/3 of Pakistan's population. So the scope is not to export much to Central Asia. The scope is to obtain the cheaper energy from Central Asia for the economic growth of this region. So this is my take on it.
So what I understand from very interestingly put down, an unstable Afghanistan is in the US interest.
For the moment, yes.
For the moment. So that implies that Afghanistan is not less important this time even as it used to be important for the US before.
Yes, I agree with you.
Mr. Jawad, do you have anything to say about this?
I would agree with Brigadier Saab in terms of what he said about connectivity. I think that is where Afghanistan is also very important, because Pakistan wants to promote connectivity, China wants to promote that, even India needs energy, as Brigadier Saab mentioned. Russia has a lot of energy, but it needs more connectivity for trade. In Central Asian countries, they don't have access to the oceans, and for them, connectivity is very important. And the problem has been the instability in Afghanistan. So many projects, for example, TAPI, Kaza 1000 or 2000, and many other projects were stalled or never took off because of what was happening in Afghanistan. So I think, and we have to remember, what was the basic plank of SCO? SCO was formed to promote regional security and regional prosperity through more trade and connectivity. And in that, of course, Afghanistan has a crucial importance in terms of its geographical location, because it can serve as a bridge. And Pakistan, which is a natural bridge, can only play that part if there's peace in Afghanistan, stability in Afghanistan. So in that way, it is important. Now, the other point is that when SCO was formed so many years ago, initially it was Shanghai 5, and then, of course, more countries joined and became SCO. One of the reasons was for those countries, for Russia and China primarily, and then there were the stans originally, the 4 stans. They wanted to limit the Western influence in this region by promoting this regional cooperation. Western influence, of course, the US influence, right? So that is why the perspective of SCO could be different from the perspective of the US, because Russia, China are the prime drivers. Now you have India as well, but but India, for India, SCO is perhaps not as important, because if you notice, why did they decide to have a virtual summit rather than, an in-person summit? Because that does diminish the optics, not just the optics, the significance of the event as well. There are reasons for that. On the other hand, they're planning to have G20 in September, and that, because that is where they're focusing now. So the thing is, I think the connectivity is very important, and in terms of the sort of the Afghanistan's relevance for SCO. Now, as far as the US is concerned, personally, I would say, that is my take on it. For US, Afghanistan, like I said, is not as important as before. Before, the type of money they were spending, the type of political, not just the money, the political capital they were spending on Afghanistan was immense. Now they're not doing that, not even a small, tiny fraction of that. But having said that, in my view, it doesn't mean that they would like to see instability in Afghanistan. Okay, perhaps Brigadier Saab's perspective could be that, because of this US on one side and Russia, China on the other side, and the Americans wouldn't really want to see a regional cooperation growing, which helps Russia and China. So in an indirect way, that could be the perspective. But in my view, instability in Afghanistan could threaten the US more directly, because if this instability continues, eventually, it could lead to a situation in Afghanistan where, again, some terrorist groups could pose a threat to US interest or the US itself, as it has happened in the past. So I don't think personally that Americans would take that risk, in comparison to to some indirect advantage that they would be getting from instability in Afghanistan. But having said that, all countries, when they have strategic interests, there's a pretty deep thinking and and things are not always what they seem on the surface.
Right. You earlier mentioned that Pakistan is engaging with the Afghan authorities. So far, the engagement has been carried out. What sort of do you think is there any understanding here in Islamabad that there is a realization among the Taliban ranks about the potential dividends which are associated with regional connectivity in particular?
Personally, I think in the past we have seen the Taliban adopting reasonable positions on and statements that have come from the some of their leadership, whereby they have they've showed an understanding of how important economics can be. So I would not think that they are oblivious of that, and I would not even think that this is something that they don't want. I think they have said that, and in some of the actions as well, you see it evident. Now the problem is, why does it not translate to keeping of the promises they've made? And for example, some of the key promises that Afghanistan soil would not be used for terrorism, in terms some promises in terms of freedoms, some promises in terms of inclusivity. These were the promises that they made in the very beginning, after taking over. So what is the reason? Is that the internal politics, or the fact that they believe that to sustain and strengthen their power in Afghanistan, they need to take a more rigid position? So there could be a debate on that.
So do you think that could be done without inclusivity? Taking all the stakeholders on board, or making an inclusive government over there as per the promise?
Well, we haven't seen that happening to the degree that the world was expecting. And why has it not happened? Is it the gap between the words and the actions, or the sort of political considerations have outweighed, let's say, the intent? These are open questions, but the fact is that it hasn't happened.
Right, Brigadier Zeeshan, do you think forming an inclusive government would give even more strength to the Afghan Taliban, so they could have that pretty much control over the entire territory, especially when it comes to dealing with terrorism emanating from the Afghan soil?
Theoretically, yes, that inclusivity will give a lot of credibility to the government in Kabul, and will certainly serve many interests of Afghan people. However, the reality is a bit tricky in Afghanistan. One, it is a classic tribal society still, and Taliban may not have kind of control as any democratic country may have, even in the developing world. And the regional powers, provincial powers in Afghanistan are based on their tribal affinities and their tribal power structure. So Taliban government in Kabul, Afghan Taliban government in Kabul, they may not be at the moment that flexible enough to have the kind of inclusivity as being demanded by international community. You may find it subsequently, but it is difficult for them today. However, I just want to add one thing with regards to Pakistan, that Pakistan, why not Pakistan is pressing upon the Afghan government in Kabul that they have to honor the commitments, etc. Pakistan first has to stabilize itself. We are not entirely stable politically.
I seek your pardon over here. Pakistan authorities have repeatedly been asking the Afghan authorities, especially when it comes to dealing with terrorism, ensuring that Afghan soil is not used for terrorism against Pakistan.
We do that, but certainly the kind of political and economic issues we are handling within Pakistan, I don't think so. We have much time and effort available to press upon in a sustained way upon Kabul to pay heed to our request.
Your point is well taken. I seek once again your pardon over here. We are unfortunately short of time. Your quick comment regarding the long-standing disputes and the resolution of those as per the United Nations principles, which was also highlighted by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif today in his address at the SCO Heads of State meeting. He said, let me quote, that these must be addressed immediately and settled amicably before it is too late?
Oh, well, I would say that Prime Minister has very categorically made this point. And keeping in view the scope of SCO and the prospects of SCO in future, if not United Nations, we may say that in future SCO may be a forum where there can be a discussion to settle the issues between Pakistan and India in order to realize the connectivity, which is the main reason for exploiting the potential of this region.
Right.
So that can be a very good start.
Right, Mr. Jauhar, your understanding of this peaceful settlements between the member states, it is also mentioned in the SCO Charter Article 2 in the principles of the SCO.
No, that's a very important point, because you can't have durable peace without resolving such territorial disputes. And the Prime Minister not just mentioned that, but he also mentioned about the right to self-determination, and I think that was very apt as well, because the core objective of SCO is promoting regional peace, security, connectivity, and prosperity. And when you have these type of festering wounds, you can't have your objective fulfilled in a smooth way. And we've seen that happening. SARC has, like in many ways, it has failed to take off primarily because of these disputes, and primarily because of the dispute of Jammu and Kashmir between India and Pakistan, amongst other things. So in the same way, SCO cannot reach its goals, particularly in the realm of connectivity, promoting trade, promoting other avenues of peaceful cooperation between its members, unless and until it finds the way of resolving or helping to resolve such disputes between member countries. And for that, the Prime Minister also mentioned that the way forward is there. The UN has clear, like the UN resolutions, for instance, or the UN mechanisms, that should be employed. So I think it was very relevant in his address. And of course, the freedoms and the right to self-determination of the people under occupation, that is very important as well.
So you clearly see a potential regarding SCO in dealing in the peaceful settlement of long-standing disputes.
I see definitely a possibility of facilitation, and I think that would be very conducive to the objectives of the organization itself. So yeah, definitely.
Mr. Jauhar Saleem, a former Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. In the studio, we're also joined by Brigadier Retired Mohammad Zeeshan, Director General, Center for Peace, Security and Development Studies. Brigadier Zeeshan, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching.